America has been under a political dark ages for decades now, where our country has become less like our country was meant to be and has morphed into this monstrous doppelganger, which is causing a lot of Americans to lose faith and is causing hell to wreak in our institutions. But how did we get here? What's the history of this period? And how can we regain a conception of a national identity, a conception of Americanism that will allow us to channel the fires of 1776 and 1789 and so on and so forth to restore our country to the vitality it deserves? My friends, I will get into all of that in 1 second. We will discuss this very important topic in 1 second. Before we do, hello. I am Christian Watson. I am your host today. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then this is the channel to be. I encourage you to like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. Even if you disagree with me, you should be in the comments expressing why you disagree, because that's going to be the way we refine truth. Refinement by fire, not refinement by complacency, which appears to be the MO of so many influencers and so many public voices these days, to keep their audiences complacent and ignorant. But I digress. Now on to the topic of de-Americanization, as I call it. Now, a lot of people have been concerned about some of the recent things happening in our culture with the Donald Trump trial and the shenanigans that happened around that, with the January 6th protesters being locked into gulags, with the, going even further back than this, the Patriot Act being passed, and Americans' basic privacy rights being destroyed, the redistribution of wealth that has taken place through progressive policies such as high taxation, and this, so the prevalence of this sort of phrase that the wealthy have to pay their fair share, this sort of destruction of womanhood that's taking place at the altar of gender ideology. So many different things are happening that are causing a lot of Americans, especially a lot of rightward Americans, to be depressed and upset. And a lot of people don't know the cause of this. A lot of folks want to say the cause of this is classical liberalism, or the cause of this is a weak government that was not assertive enough to stop this. There are so many different people that have so many different ideas. Then there are some folks like Curtis Jarvin who want to deal with these problems, not return to what America was and should be, but instead install a monarchy. There are other folks that want to empower the community to have power over your life in order to preserve virtue, when in all reality, that category of behavior is antithetical to virtue, because true virtue comes from the heart and rises up into society. It does not come from society and into your heart. And those that don't understand that will be perplexed when their good-intentioned policies actually produce bad consequences. It's the curse of hubris. There are so many different people that have so many different explanations. But what if I told you this phenomenon is rather new in the context of history? And this phenomenon has only been going on for about 80 or 90 or so years. Not even 100 years. This phenomenon is fresh, which then also means that we're going to have the ability to address it, as opposed to if it was deeply entrenched. Now, before I continue on this topic, some people will say, Christian, isn't America already de-Americanized? Isn't the Constitution already dead? Aren't our institutions already deviant? Isn't this country no longer what it was meant to be? I don't necessarily agree with this line of questioning or these arguments, and I'm going to explain why I don't agree in my incoming video, The Case for American Optimism, where I actually dig into these questions, I dig into these assumptions, and I actually explain to you why I think they come from a place that acknowledges part of what's going on, but they are not holistic, and fundamentally, they are not a rational appraisal of what's going on in our country. But I will say this. In order to fix the problem, we have to acknowledge that there is a problem. So to the extent that I will agree with those people that are saying the Constitution is dead, by the way, I don't think that's not the case. But to the extent that I agree with those people, I will say there's a problem where the Constitution has lost its power over American society in some respects, and we have to address this. Now, in order for me to talk about de-Americanization and what it means for America to become less than what it has been, I must talk about, for a moment, what America is. A lot of people identify our country with sensibilities. Some people, like Vivek Ramaswamy, someone who I respect, but who I think is wrong on this, will say that what the meaning of Americanism is, it means that you have faith, you're a patriot, and things of that sort. But those are just adjectives that describe sensibilities. And when you try to identify sensibilities with a national identity and a broader concept of nationhood, you fail because sensibilities are fundamentally personal. They exist in the realm of the subjective, and therefore they will differ from place to place and person to person. You can't build a nation off of the shoddy ground of subjectivism. You can only build a nation off of the ground of first-rate principles, as a well-noted Supreme Court justice said in reference to his defense of Americanism. And so, we have to ask ourselves, what are the first principles of Americanism? Americanism is not just a sensibility. It's not just a concept of nationhood or citizenship. It is a worldview. It is a worldview that affirms the nature of reality as being instructive to the conduct of man, i.e. a worldview based on natural law theory that was refined through the Enlightenment. It is a worldview based on seeing man's reason as a value, as opposed to seeing reason as just one old tool to use whenever you need to get an advantage. It is a worldview based on the idea that internal refinement systems like checks and balances are essential for a good and well-oiled government. It is a worldview that assumes that the private sphere and the public sphere are two separate categories that deserve two separate realms of moral consideration. It is a worldview that believes that cooperation and community are the bedrock of a good nation. It is a worldview that says that virtue and good character are necessary to preserve a free society. It is a worldview that is about ethics, that is about nationhood, that is about personal character, that is about human nature, and it goes to the core of what it actually means to be a human being in the first place. That is what Americanism is. That is what America is, and that is what the founders understood. But so many people sell themselves short by considering Americanism a matter of one people in one place at one time, the lie of Edmund Burke. No, America is a people. It does have a place, it does have a time, but it is based not on the crude mentalities of men shackled by tradition that is not checked by reason. No. It is based instead on universal principles, axioms that go to the bedrock of what it means to be living in reality. That's what it means to be an American. That is fundamentally what it means to be an American. Now, when I talk about de-Americanization, I'm talking about how this philosophy, this understanding, and this worldview has been shifted and changed by the winds of time and by those within our institutions who are supposed to safeguard them. So in order for me to address this issue, I have to go through parts of American history to show you when the train got off the tracks, so to speak. So let's begin with one of the defining characteristics of what it means to be an American, and that is believing in a sense of self-ownership, which is then confirmed through the notion of property rights. So in order to be someone in a free society, you have to possess some level of ownership over yourself, and that has to be able to enable you to exist in that free society. And this was a tradition understood for a very long time in American history. In fact, going all the way back to the Revolutionary period, going all the way back to the sort of colonial period, there were aspects of America in the colonial period that recognized this. But in the Revolutionary period, this rallying cry for property, which was indeed the basis of the Fourth Amendment, the basis of a lot of these different things that we have in our Constitution and our moral ethos as Americans, it was rooted in a notion of private property. In fact, during the Revolutionary era, as James Ely, a brilliant writer, Vanderbilt University notes, he notes that several states in the Revolutionary era, like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, affirmed that all persons had the natural, essential, and inherent right of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. And of course, this theme continued throughout the centuries of American existence. This theme continued throughout the early Republic. This theme continued throughout the 19th century. And this theme stopped in the 20th century. Now, from Chief Justice John Marshall to Chief Justice Melville W. Fuller, the Supreme Court had a strong view of property rights. The Supreme Court believed that property rights and contractual rights were the bedrock of American civilization, and property rights and contractual rights would be a safeguard against tyranny. And the Supreme Court, on several cases, upheld this principle. Now, not in every case. There were cases where public use and other kinds of systems were prioritized, but mostly this is the case. I'll read from Eli's article. He says, the key point is that during this era between Marshall and Fuller, the rights of property owners were consistently accorded a high standard. 19th century justices never relegated economic rights to a subordinate status. On the contrary, they frequently invoked the traditional tie between the respect for private property and individual liberty. Justice Stephen J. Field, the most influential jurist of the Gilded Era, said this in 1890. It should never be forgotten that protection to property in persons cannot be separated. When property is insecure, the right of persons are unsafe. Protection to the one goes with protection to the other, and there can neither be prosperity nor progress where either is certain. It should also be known that the Supreme Court throughout this era was incredibly skeptical of redistributive policies. The idea that you can take wealth from somebody else and give it to someone else, it was incredibly incredibly held in high skeptical regard to them, and they made several decisions denouncing this. Now, they based these on first principles, on all American ideas. Now, in the 20th century, as Eli mentions, this long history of contractual rights and property rights was disrupted by the progressive era reformers in the progressive era. I'll quote from Eli, the progressives were particularly concerned with protection of employees in the workplace. To achieve their reform, the progressives urged a more active role for both state and federal governments in regulating the economy. They placed great faith in governance by the experts, and by doing this, Eli goes on to explain, they disrupted the spirit of 1776. They disrupted this original constitutionalist notion of property, birthed from John Locke's second treatise, and they instead inserted a new sort of European, sort of Prussian notion of property, where it is subject to revision and to control by society to serve the common good. This, in my opinion, was the beginning of de-Americanization. This progressive era conception of property that quite literally launched an assault, as Eli mentions, on the constitutional notion of property. And they, as Eli, I will quote him, asserted that existing constitutional doctrines exaggerated the importance of property and contractual rights. They literally changed the Constitution, changed hundreds of years at that point of legal tradition to fit their political agenda. America went from caring about first principles institutionally to caring instead about the common good, which then enabled tyrants and experts who were serving tyrants to forcibly change the structure of our country. And unfortunately, in that time, due to the efforts of propagandists and people who were swayed by this new ideological fervor, the public pretty much went along with it, unfortunately. Public opinion polls about this time were very high. So then you go into the 20s and the 30s. And we see a ramping up of this de-Americanization, the dissolution of separation of powers, for example, which happened throughout the 20s and throughout the 30s by empowering administrative bodies who were unelected to have powers that were not appointed to them by the Constitution, which then also violated the non-delegation clause, which is a key part of the separation of powers. And the Supreme Court unfortunately went along with this in some cases. That hastened de-Americanization. Because no longer do you have a system based on internal checks, you now have a system where one branch is stronger than the other branches and can check the other branches without actually checking them in the truest sense, but instead asserting dominance over them. So on and so on. And there are plenty of examples of this. So then you move on to the New Deal. And when the New Deal happens, Americans' notions of property, of moral relationships, and of society is dramatically shifted from one where they are involved with their community, and this happens on local level, to one where the government is now an active agent in the maintenance and the provision of social goods, therefore disrupting the private and public economy that the very idea of Americanism assumes, and asserting a sort of state tyranny over that. And so people began to see the government as a provider. Welfarism was the consequence of the New Deal, which was birthed by a kind of panic and a kind of necessity in the society at that time. Then you go to the Great Society, which was another example of this sort of de-Americanization, where LBJ makes it seem as if government has not only the ability, but the need to restructure communities to fit a certain ideological goal. So the presumption here is that no longer does power come from the bottom up. Power instead, and changes that comes from on high. These sort of restructuring of terms, whether you agree with them or not, are fundamentally anti-American. Then you continue on, the war on drugs, the military-industrial complex of the Cold War being funded and supported, reshaped how Americans saw their role in the world. Before the 1920s, Americans they weren't isolationists, as some people would say. They were cognizant about respecting national interest when it related to getting involved in foreign wars, which I wish we were doing that today. But once the post-war consensus kicked in, many Americans were captured by the notion that America was this great stabilizer and that we had to go around the world to patrol it and keep it in check. That's not an American ideal. That is an ideal birthed by foreign institutions that don't hold our values, but instead hold this idea of internationalism that defies national borders and that believes in the first place that national borders fundamentally don't even exist. That's what that was. But then let's go a little bit back to kind of capture this. All of this stuff eventually culminated in the birth of the old world media, NBC, ABC, CBS, the Vanguard, which we know through documents worked with people like the FBI during COINTELPRO to persecute activist groups they didn't like with false stories. We know a lot of these people, like Walter Cronkite, gatekept information about the Vietnam War. The old world media became the validator of information for several generations, and really for many people it still is, except Gen Z and Gen Alpha are not under that spell anymore, and the millennials are kind of moving away from that. But for a long time, it became the validator of what was truth, and for that reason, the unchecked excesses of power that were birthed through progressivism remained unchecked, and they were instead enhanced, and consent for them was manufactured through sophisticated media propaganda operations. This is de-Americanization, and this maintained the dark ages that I believe we've been under. Now, what's breaking it? Decentralization. Politicians driven by decentralization who are willing to speak out against what was once a sacred cow, but what is now, as properly American-minded people should see, a subject of critique. Politicians like Donald Trump, who rejected the norms and customs of the old world, unenlightened, dark age American political system based on progressivism, based on false validity from the old world media, and instead embraced a kind of bull in the china shop approach, which destroyed that system, or at least left it on its last breath, and intensified the fury and the power of voices not connected with that system, who then use their own platforms through the internet and other means to get their voices out. That is what is causing the light to break in the sky and disperse the darkness of our political dark ages. But we're not going to escape this curse of de-Americanization by running away from what America is. We're not going to escape this curse of de-Americanization by running away from what America should be. We're going to escape it by standing up and reasserting the over 100 plus years of constitutional ideology that guided our nation until recently, and that preserved our nation even through a damn civil war. If the Constitution didn't work, the Civil War, we should have lost the Civil War, in my opinion. I know that's going to cause people to say, Christian, whatever, I don't care if you argue with me. If the Constitution did not stand a test of time, we would have never won the Civil War. Because the Civil War was an inflection point. It was a test. Can the system maintain itself? And then afterwards, can the system maintain itself even when there are people in the country split on ideological lines, north and south? The question is yes. But progressivism, that has made the country just go into a new state, because it's no longer America is being talked about. It is a progressive conceptualization of America. My friends, to escape the political dark ages, we must be courageous, we must be bold, we must reject sacred cows, and most importantly, we must be willing to have conversations like this, where we test our assumptions, where we dig into our history, where we study philosophy, and where we understand how the enemy has gained so many victories so that we can push back ultimately and win. And I believe if we do that as Americans, we can have another golden age of American prosperity that the world has never seen before. But if we don't do it, we may very well lose the country that we love so dearly. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to keep this message out there. If you want to support me, you can do PayPal, Patreon, do whatever you want. I got fired up in this video, you guys can see. I'm sweating, but it's all good. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive.